Okay, it's a great turnout. Thank you all for coming. On behalf of the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies, it's my great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Trent Walker. Dr. Walker is he's about 2/3 of the way through the first year of a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies, also with an appointment as lecturer in religious studies here at Stanford. And he came to us after a research fellowship in Thailand, after completing a PhD at Berkeley, and before that, where it all began as a BA, as an undergraduate student here at Stanford in the Religious Studies Department, a degree he completed, I guess, a little over 10 years ago. Trent has, unlike some of us, had an enviably productive pandemic. He's published a couple of articles in 2020, has another 6 forthcoming, including a special issue on the state of Theravada studies for the Journal of Global Buddhism that he is co-editing with one of our previous Ho Center postdocs, Alex Koyanidis. And this isn't even counting his translations from Thai and Khmer that have either been published or are in press at the moment. He's now working as a part of his postdoc on a book entitled Classical Reading, Vernacular Writing, a bitextual history of Southeast Asian Buddhism, and will be teaching an undergraduate course for us here at Stanford this summer on Buddhism and the family. Now, beyond just the pandemic period, if you want a sense of the scope and the scale of Trent's work on Buddhism in Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, you should take a look at his beautifully designed website, which is just packed full of information, including articles, TV appearances, audio recordings, and the full text of his 1,600-page dissertation. Yes, you heard me correctly, 1,600-page dissertation. Today, he will be sharing with us a sliver of this already remarkable body of work in a talk entitled Sethanabeda and Cinderella, Multiple Rebirths, Bilingual Sermons, and Popular Narratives in Southeast Asia. At the end of the talk, there will be plenty of time for questions. So at that time, we'll ask you, you can go ahead and turn your microphones on to ask Trent any questions you like. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to you. Take it away, Trent.
Thank you so much, John, for that extremely kind and generous introduction. And thank you very much to Irene, to Stephanie, Paul, Joseph, and everyone at the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies for making this talk today possible. It's really moving to see the faces and names of so many people who I have learned from at Stanford, at Berkeley, in Cambodia, in Thailand, and other places across the world here with us on this call. So a bow of thanks and gratitude to all of you. And I hope that you enjoy the talk. And more importantly, I'm really delighted to have a chance to engage in discussion with you all. So my talk is about 45 minutes. And then after that, we should have time for discussion. So my talk this evening is based on my current book project, Classical Reading, Vernacular Writing, a Bitextual History of Southeast Asian Buddhism. This is a project that's grounded in manuscript sources from the 16th to the 20th centuries. And that project centers a particular kind of textual transmission, that of the Indic vernacular bilingual text or bitext, as the core technology that made possible the spread of new religious ideas and modes of discourse all across Southeast Asia. And in my talk today, I have 3 goals that are germane to that broader intellectual project. First, I want to move beyond earlier scholarship that saw Southeast Asia as the receiver, but not the producer of religious ideas. Second, I want to correct some biases found in previous research on bilingual texts and demonstrate that Southeast Asian bitexts are not the result of private or idiosyncratic ways of reading Indian Buddhist scripture, but rather products of a regional set of scholastic norms with global parallels. And third, I aim to show how bitext, and in particular bitextual manuscripts, are not limited to the monasteries of pre-colonial Southeast Asia, but also transmit ideas and narratives that continue to live on through modern poems, film, and social media. So I'm going to share my screen with you at this juncture. And in my talk today, I've structured into 3 acts, as it were, and each of which is grounded around a pair of questions. And I'll begin by exploring the relationship between Buddhism and local religion in Southeast Asia, particularly through divergent perspectives on the nature of mind and rebirth. Is consciousness singular or plural? Why are people born unequal in religious systems where rebirth is a given? Then in Act 2, I'll turn to the subject of bilingual sermons, drawing on my broader research project on the process of Indic vernacular textual transmission in Southeast Asia, and also the invention of scripture. And given the technology of the bitext, I'd like to ask, how do you write in 2 languages at once? And moreover, what makes a folktale in such a context Buddhist? Finally, in Act 3, I'll look at the circulation of bilingual sermons, verse epics, and new media. I'll ask, how do you text in 18th century Laos? And with the question I'll close with, and connects to the title of my talk here, how did Cinderella come to Cambodia? In other words, what makes the transformation of religious texts into popular media possible? The node that connects all of these intersecting questions together also comes from the title of my talk, is the Jetana Bheda, which is a Pali vernacular text or bitext. The Pali title, Jetana Bheda, is itself a bit of an enigma. No such Pali composition exists. To hazard a translation that fits the vernacular understanding of Jetana Bheda, I would offer the scattering of the minds, or by implication, the scattering of the 32 minds. The Jetana Bheda is a sermon text explicitly addressed to a lay audience. Never printed or published, it circulates exclusively in manuscript form across mainland Southeast Asia with Pali Khmer, Pali Khun, Pali Lana, Pali Lao, Pali Lu, and Pali Siamese versions. And the oldest surviving example dates from 1786 in Laos, but the text was probably composed somewhat earlier, either in Laos or in northern Thailand or Lan Na. So this map shows the dates of the earliest manuscript evidence for this text in mainland Southeast Asia. And from its place of origin in Laos or northern Thailand, it spread across the region, splitting into 2 recensions. So there's an earlier recension in 5 or 6 fascicles found here in the northern part of mainland Southeast Asia in Pali Lana, Pali Lao, Pali Khun, and Pali Lu contexts, and Laos, northeast Thailand, northeast Myanmar, and southwest China. And then there's a longer 10 or 11 fascicle recension that developed somewhat later in central Thailand, probably by the 18th, early 19th century. And this is the version that later spread to Cambodia and also Khmer-speaking communities in southern Vietnam. Most of these manuscripts are in palm leaf format, seen in the top 3 images here. So the production of palm leaf manuscripts in mainland Southeast Asia peaked across the region in the 19th century. In regions where a living manuscript culture continues to the present, such as among the Khun people of Myanmar, handmade bark pulp paper books or leporellos are preferred, as seen in the bottom image. Act 1, Rebirth. Is consciousness singular or plural? Put another way, do we have one or do we have many minds? And this is a question that was taken up by thinkers all across South and Southeast Asia, generating a wide spectrum of responses and debates. In most Buddhist traditions, the answer is both. There's one mind stream, or Citta Santana, which is itself composed of a series of many possible mind states. to use another Buddhist metaphor, there's one flame, but that can take on many possible shapes from moment to moment. And South Asian Buddhist philosophical treatises posit a range of ways in which mind or consciousness is plural. So the 5 aggregates, the 6 consciousnesses, the 8 consciousnesses are all ways of accounting for this multiplicity of mind. In normative Theravada Buddhist texts, such as the Abhidhamma Sangha, each mind moment can be understood as one of 89 possible conscious states, accompanied by a wide range of mental factors and functions. And in this particular normative context in Theravada texts, this plurality of the mind is serial, but not simultaneous. In particular, the process of death and rebirth are understood as a series of individual mind moments or mental states. The mind stream does not disperse to multiple destinations at death, but takes rebirth as a singular whole. So according to this model, from the moment of conception until death, there's a continuous flow of rest consciousness, or bhavanga, arising and passing away from moment to moment, alternating with ordinary sense consciousness. Immediately prior to death, the resting bhavanga consciousness ceases, and in the following moments, a mental object arises, conditioned by one's past actions or karma in this life. At the moment of death, a single death consciousness, or juti citta, arises. Immediately after, a single rebirth consciousness, or patisandhi citta, arises. And on the basis of that final mental object in the last moments of life, there is this linking to a new rebirth. And thus the multiple possibilities of the mind expressed in this serial way are reduced to one final last moment and a singular destination of rebirth. Throughout mainland Southeast Asia, both among Buddhist societies as well as those who practice indigenous religions, the dominant model of the mind is plural, but in a simultaneous rather than in a serial sense. And we can call this the multiple soul or multiple spirit or multiple vital essences model. The basic premise is that we as human beings are inhabited by a collection of wild, unruly, even fun-loving souls, who each of which has a marked tendency to wander off from our body. And in the Cambodian or Khmer or Khmer model, 19 souls or pralung inhabit our bodies during our lives. And this number 19 is accounted for in different ways, whether in references to Buddhist philosophical treatises or through an esoteric interpretation of the alphabet. Among various Bai groups in Southeast Asia, including the Lao, Lana, Lu, Kun, 32 souls is the accepted number, known as Kwan or Kuan. The number 32 here is linked to sometimes the number of parts in the human body, 12 of which are understood to come from our mothers and 20 from our fathers. And as we'll see later on, the genetic resonances of this kind of theory, particularly as it shows up in the Cetana Bheda, are quite striking. And similar to the Tibetan conception of the La or a Taoist model of the Huan, these souls are not fixed to the body. So they're capricious and untamed. They're apt to abandon our own bodies, particularly at liminal moments or times of crisis, whether we're moving or returning from abroad, when an accident has occurred, birth, illness, death. And with this understanding in mind, Southeast Asians have developed a range of rituals to call the souls back and fix them within the body. And this can take place as an outdoor ritual at night, pictured here, chanting and shouting for the souls to return from the dangerous jungle back into the body of the patient. Or more commonly, such rituals can be organized indoors using a variety of liturgies, rites, and ritual implements to entice the souls to return to someone's body. And ritual chants for inviting the souls to return to the body sometimes name these souls as residing in particular parts of the body. And this is the case for a Lao chant for fixing the souls of someone who has just returned to their home village after a long journey. So in this particular chant, we hear, "Come here, 32 inner Kuan. Kuan of your delicate ears, Kuan of your discerning nose, Kuan of your soft heart. Come here today, this day." And so the 32 souls are invited to come back into the body. Here, I'd like to argue that the Chaitanya Bheda, this sermon, which I'll discuss in more detail in a moment, aims to reconcile Buddhist and local Southeast Asian models of the mind. And one way it does this is by inserting the 32 souls idea into a Buddhist framework. So according to the multiple souls model, it's natural for the mind in this multiple state to scatter and disperse during this life. Ritual effort, and particular ritual technologies, are needed to make a plural mind singular. The Chaitanya Bheda extends this logic to death and rebirth. So if one's 32 minds are not unified at the moment of death, according to this text, they can be scattered across samsara, taking rebirth in different bodies. The normative Buddhist model posits one mind stream, one rebirth, but the Chaitanya Bheda takes a different view. Our 32 souls or minds scattered at death can combine with those from other originally separate beings, creating stunning physical, social, and psychological diversity. And this very diversity hypothesized by the Chaitanya Bheda leads to another question. Why are people born unequal? What factors shape the rebirth into a particular form and set of abilities in this life? The Chaitanya Bheda is framed as the Buddha's response to his disciples' question on this issue. The usual Buddhist answer is, of course, is karma. We're born into different circumstances on account of our past actions, whether in an immediate past life or in some more remote circumstances. The Chaitanya Bheda instead emphasizes the importance of unifying our many minds prior to death. The natural state of affairs entails plural minds leading to plural rebirths, with differences in wealth, appearance, intelligence, sexual preference, and gender identity due to the 32 minds originally belonging to different people. The ideal, according to the text, is to constantly practice meditation on the 32 parts of the body, the so-called Tvatung-Sakara Kamatthana, during one's life. And thus, when death approaches, if one can be sufficiently concentrated on a particular bodily orifice or door, all 32 citta or minds will exit that door at death and be reborn altogether in a new body with extraordinary powers as a result. Act 2, bilingual sermons. The Chaitanya Bheda is a bitext, and this very bilingual construction is key to its success in spreading across Southeast Asia. But first of all, what's a bitext? This is a term that I've borrowed from linguistics. And in that particular context, a bitext is a bilingual presentation of a text that includes both a source text in one language, as well as its translation into another. And bitexts have many applications, whether in language pedagogy, corpus linguistics, and a natural language processing. But here I'm interested in the relevance of this concept and thinking about it with Southeast Asian religious texts. So therefore, I define an Indic vernacular bitext as a bilingual presentation of a text that combines portions in an Indic prestige language, usually Pali or Sanskrit, and a local vernacular, typically in an interphrasal, that is phrase by phrase or interlinear format, line by line. Most bitexts in manuscript form are in the same script and in the same color ink. In certain instances, however, multiple scripts and colors are used, which helps to visualize their structure. So on the bottom left here is an interphrasal Pali-Siamese bitext with the Pali portions in red Kham script and the Siamese portions in black Thai script. And on the bottom right is an interlinear Pali-Lao bitext with the Pali portions incised in brown Kham script and the Lao portions inked in green Tham script. And the Chaitanya Bheda is an interphrasal Pali vernacular bitext. In other words, it's more like the image on the bottom left, but of course, none of the versions of it use two different colors or two different scripts. So it doesn't visually pop out in this way, but it has that kind of structure. One aim of my broader book project is to trace the historical development of Southeast Asian BITEX over time. Their roots lie in old Sinhalese compositions as well as first millennium Southeast Asian inscriptions, but they really only take off as a pan-regional form in the 15th and 16th centuries in Burma, Laos, and Siam, spreading from there to nearly all of the Theravada communities of Southeast Asia, including the the Lu and Yunnan province in China, in the Shan in northern Burma, and even some Vietnamese-speaking communities who have, in the mid-20th century, converted to Theravada Buddhism in southern Vietnam. So as I mentioned earlier, the Jetanabheda was likely composed in 18th century Laos or Lana during a period when bitextual writings came to dominate Southeast Asian Buddhist discourse. Another aim of my broader project is to demonstrate the close parallels and how BITEX function across the region. My goal here is not only to make the technical sophistication of BITEX legible, but also to make for ready comparison with other forms of bilingual religious texts, particularly in Western Europe, East Asia, and the Malay worlds. The local terms used to describe BITEX highlight both their specific techniques, whether it's parsing, annotation, rearrangement, or gloss, as well as their core functions, including serving as a support for reading a classical text or as a guide for oral performance. The core techniques of Indic vernacular BITEX are complex. I'd be more than happy to address them in the Q&A period if you're interested in some facet as it relates to my talk today. For now, however, let me just emphasize the following. A BITEX may be based on an existing Pali or Sanskrit text, or it may invent such a source text. In the case of the Jetanabheda, the Pali source was invented by the author of the BITEX. It exists only in the form of an interphrasal Pali vernacular composition. Like other BITEX, the Jetanabheda engages in intense analysis of its Pali portions using the stipulated techniques of the Southeast Asian scholastic tradition. And then finally, in terms of its presentation, the Jetanabheda is part of a group of BITEX tailored for giving didactic or narrative sermons to lay audiences. In other words, it's not a philological or exegetical treatise or one conceived as poetry. Its purpose is to articulate a religious message and to tell a series of compelling stories using the bitextual framework for support. The Jetanabheda thus falls into a specific category of BITEX, invented Pali vernacular sermons. These homiletic compositions follow a regular structure that imitates bitextual versions of Buddhist canonical narratives, particularly the past life narratives of the Buddha known as Jataka. The Jetanabheda and other Pali vernacular sermons consist of an opening, a main sermon, or narrative portion, and then finally a short conclusion as outlined here. The opening is usually centered around a brief Pali quote or Pali narrative frame, which is cited in full, and then subjected to an interphrasal unpacking and expansive gloss in the vernacular language. The main sermon or narrative portion tends to mostly be in the vernacular, with the exception of key Pali phrases regarding the progression of time, the principal characters, select doctrinal terms, dialogue scenes, and sometimes also extended Pali quotations, whether in prose or in verse. And the final conclusion is usually short, but like the opening, tends to be filled with these kinds of dense interphrasal passages. So to visualize these kinds of structures more clearly, let's take a look at the opening passage of a Pali Kun version of the Jetanabheda. And this particular manuscript was inked by a Kun-speaking scribe in Myanmar in 1962. Like most of other Southeast Asian scripts, Kun script is read left to right, top to bottom, just like in English. Punctuation is rare, though spaces can serve as a break between words, as well as between major clauses. Here I've annotated the Pali portions in red and the Kun portions in blue. The bitextual sermon follows the expected form. We have an opening invocation in Pali, then a complete quote in Pali, then a bitextual or bilingual in this sense address to the lay audience in both Pali and Kun, then a shortened form of the initial Pali quote alongside a Kun introduction to the narrative frame, and then that narrative frame is provided in full in Pali and then unpacked and analyzed in Kun. So what's happening in the narrative frame in this particular section is we learn that Anuruddha, a leading disciple of the Buddha, has become disturbed by this question I raised earlier of why people are born unequal. Anuruddha, being unable to resolve this quandary on his own, despite his attempts to resolve it in a deep state of meditation, takes his inquiry to the Buddha. And after this opening section, all extant recensions of the Cetana Bheda proceed to an account of Anuruddha's question. And here I'll quote from the Pali Khmer recension of the Cetana Bheda, or known as the Cetana Bhetiya in Khmer, as preserved in these roll film images, the original palm leaf manuscript. Anuruddha's question is presented as expected in this interphrasal bitextual format. The portions in Pali here I've placed in bold, while the vernacular Khmer is in plain Roman type, both in the transliteration and in the translation. I'll read this passage in one of the traditional Khmer declamation styles used for bilingual sermons. You have a sense of how it functions in an oral context, followed by a translation into English. And just note that the Pali portions are pronounced according to local phonology, so that the opening phrase, Bhante Bhagawa, becomes Pwante Bhagawi. Pwante Bhagawi. មកពុតណាព្រះដ៏មានបុណ្យដល់ប្រសើរយោចសង្សារេឧបចេតវារីនរជនជាតិឯណាអន្តតមកយកកັບកំណត់កើតក្នុងភពវត្តសង្សារបណ្ដាជារូបប្រុសរូបស្រីខ្លះមានឫទ្ធានៅកំឡងកំដោយរូបឆោមលំពស់នោះល្អសោភាមានប្រាជ្ញាបរាភវេសុលុហរំលៀងបញ្ចខន្តកោតឯមុខពលវីបញ្ញវីមានកម្លាំងប្រាជ្ញានៅឫទ្ធាកម្លាំងជាស្រេចជាប្រុសដូចមូលនោះដែរឬទេ Oh fortunate one, O blessed Lord, anyone having been reborn in samsara, any person cycling through various rebirths in the cycle of samsara, in a male body or a female body, perhaps endowed with power, strength, intelligence, grace, or beauty, in destruction, who upon the destruction of the five aggregates is reborn again, strong, intelligent, will they still be smart and mighty like that previous man or woman? Note here that the Pali portions feel fragmentary, those portions in bold, in comparison to the vernacular passages. And this is a deliberate stylistic choice found in bitextual sermons based on both real and invented Pali sources. The Pali structures and shapes the vernacular, but the core meaning is communicated to the Khmer listener in her own language. In response, the Buddha then gives a long doctrinal exegesis on Anuruddha's question, detailing the ways in which the 32 minds, implicitly tied here to the local notion of the 32 souls, are prone to wander after death. This sermon develops what we could call a quasi-genetic theory to explain why some people might be more or less attractive or intelligent than expected, since their 32 minds are composed of a mix of minds that once belonged to separate people. Aspects of human diversity long of interest to Southeast Asians, including twins, various sexual and gender identities that we might subsume under the LGBTQIA+ heading today, and people who are troubled by their birth family are brought under the aegis of this 32 mind theory. And in between births in the vast landscape of samsara, the minds might naturally reunite through a special cry emitted by the wandering citta, but the text says that this is quite rare. The general picture is one of continuous mixing of minds across lives. Not all aspects of the theory are fully worked out in the text, and this is understandable as the Jaitanabheda is one of the earliest and perhaps the boldest attempt to bring normative Buddhist and local Southeast Asian visions of the mind together. The core of the doctrine is put forth in the Jaitanabheda is summarized towards the end of the Buddha's initial response to Anuruddha. And here I'll draw from the Pali Siamese recension as preserved in the mid-19th century palm leaf manuscript. The core doctrine is first stated in Pali. Any person who meditates on the 32 parts of the body and recalls them at the moment of death, their minds will gather at one orifice, and having exited through that one orifice, will proceed to the rebirth destination. They will exit the world through the eyes alone, through the ears alone, or through the eyes, the nose, or the body. And this is followed by a more elaborate explanation in Siamese, which specifies that the minds are 32 in number, conforming to the local model of 32 souls. The Siamese portion then adds, moreover, should their minds go to be reborn through one orifice, when they are reborn, whether as a woman or as a man, that orifice will be divine, just like Princess Etivara or the young lad Sopanakumara. And so begins the first of many tales that make up the bulk of the Jaitanabheda. Act 3, religious literature and popular film. Buddhist narratives composed in Southeast Asia are celebrated for the creative ways in which they expand the Indian religious universe and map it onto local, cultural, and geographic contours. The many tales collected in the various recensions of the Jaitanabheda are no exception. Each narrative relates the adventures of an individual or a couple endowed with extraordinary or divine powers on account of having all 32 of their minds exit through a single orifice in their immediate past life. The first tale is a story of Princess Itaviraga, or sometimes Etivara, and Sopatikumara, or Sopanakumara, both of whom are endowed with the divine eye, which allows them to see across extraordinary distances, a kind of remote viewing or clairvoyance. Itaviraga, searching for a husband, surveys the realm, but finds that none of the princes and all the other realms that she's able to see with her divine eye can see and respond to her flirtations from afar, because they, of course, lack the divine eye. She eventually sees the orphan Sopatikumara, who alone is able to respond to her gestures. Sopatikumara is amused at first, having found someone who shares this quality with himself, but then he's annoyed. He wonders to himself, why is this princess flirting with me, a poor orphan in a faraway land? So he takes up a pen and writes down a message for the princess to see with her divine eye. Sopatikumara is, in essence, sending a text message to her. Elaborate visions of air travel and remote communication are found throughout Southeast Asian Buddhist and folk literature from this period. So to explore this passage, let's turn to the Pali Lao recension. This is the oldest known branch of the Jaitanabheda to understand Sopatikumara's message. Like most of the dialogue scenes in the Jaitanabheda's narratives, the private thoughts and the remote exchange of messages here between Sopatikumara and Princess Itaviraga are placed in this bitextual Pali Lao format. The message in Pali comes across as rather curt, however, here in red. I am born into a lowly family. You will be reborn into a royal line. We are not equal in lineage. Don't flirt with me. Of course, after a series of challenges and many other adventures, Itaviraga and Sopatikumara eventually get married, bringing the first story to a close. This tale, presented as a Jataka, is not known elsewhere in Buddhist literature. It's particularly memorable for the way in which the king curates or raises a bunch of man-eating tigers that he uses to successively eat each of the suitors of the princess until eventually Sopatikumara is able to win her hand in marriage. The remainder of the Pali Lao, Pali Kun, Pali Lanna, Pali Lu recensions of the Jethanabheda continue with several more stories on the benefits of having one's mind, in other words, one's 32 minds, exit out the ear, the nose, the mouth, the urethra, which the text says is capable of generating great beauty, and the anus, which the text says leads to great power. Before a closing doctrinal recapitulation, these narratives are likely drawn from folk tales, but I'm not yet aware of possible sources. In the Pali Khmer and Pali Siamese recensions, however, there's one final long narrative that's added to these, namely the story of Maranamata, or the girl whose mother died. This complex tale is framed as illustrating the benefit of someone who makes their 32 minds exit out through their heart. In their next life, they cannot be killed, no matter what their enemies try. In the tale, Maranamata and her mother both appear to have this ability. So Maranamata lives with her mother, father, and her father's cruel second wife. The cruel second wife, pretty soon after, has Maranamata's mother killed, but the mother returns immediately as a golden goby fish. Maranamata feeds the goby with rice bran every day until her stepmother kills it. A duck then finds the scales, and Maranamata plants those scales, and they grow into an eggplant bush, which is her mother coming back to life. And then her stepsisters and her stepmother get wind that Maranamata is now tending to this eggplant bush and have it chopped down. After it's been chopped down, a cat then finds the roots, digs them up, and gives them to Maranamata. And Maranamata takes them, plants them, and they grow into this beautiful ornamental tree. One day, the king is out surveying his realm, comes across this tree, and is immediately smitten by it and wants to bring it to his palace. However, all of the king's men and other attendants are not able to lift this tree and make it move from its place. Only Maranamata is able to talk to the tree is her mother, and encourage the tree to go to the palace. So seeing this extraordinary ability of Maranamata, the king then falls in love with Maranamata and appoints her as his queen and invites her and the mother, being the tree, to go back to the palace. The jealous second wife then hatches a series of plans to kill Maranamata. But all of these quite elaborate plans are foiled one by one as Maranamata is killed, only to be immediately reborn as a bird. And then this bird, through imitating the ways of other animals in the forest, is able to evolve into a deer, and then evolve into a monkey, and then finally into a human woman. And at the end of the tale, Maranamata, back in human form, and the king are happily reunited, reign in peace and splendor, and also be sure always to give extra alms to ducks and to cats. And in the remainder of Act 3, I'll focus on this Cinderella-like story, for it illuminates how Pali vernacular Buddhist sermons facilitated the circulation of narrative texts across Asia. The parallels between the European Cinderella narrative and Maranamata's tale in the Jethanabheda are more than just coincidence. So if we're to answer this question of how did Cinderella come to Cambodia, we have to start in China. And there the story of Ye Xian is recorded in a 9th century collection of strange and foreign tales. And some scholars have argued that actually this Cinderella-like tale of Ye Xian is actually the primary source for the European narrative, and that it itself is likely rooted in a Zhuang legend from southern China. Just as in Maranamata, the heroine's mother has died and is raised by a cruel stepmother. Ye Xian likewise nourishes a golden fish, the spirit of her dead mother, and when this fish is killed by her stepmother, another reincarnation appears. The Zhuang language is also from the Thai family, like Lao and Siamese, modern Central Thai. The variants of this Ye Xian tales begin to circulate in Thai-speaking cultures and eventually make their way to central Thailand or Siam. And there, the tale becomes known as the Bla Butong narrative, or the golden goby, after the type of fish that the heroine's mother becomes after her death. The Bla Butong narrative is itself brought into a narrative poem format in the 18th century, published in a book form in the early 20th century. They're pictured on the lower left. The tale subsequently becomes a staple of Thai film and also TV dramas, with 3 major film adaptations and several serialized TV productions, some stretching into the dozens of episodes. And it was this actually very long version of the Bla Butong narrative that was in Thailand that became well known in Laos through cross-border TV broadcasts. But how did this narrative end up in Cambodian and Thai recensions of the Jetanabheda? It appears that sometime in the 18th century, the Bla Butong tale, this by that time a Central Thai or Siamese folktale, was inserted into the Pali-Siamese version of the Jetanabheda, which, as you recall before, is longer than the version that circulated in the more northern regions of mainland Southeast Asia, with the frame, narrative, and the characters' names altered to fit the Buddhist context. So the heroine of the tale in the Bla Butong narrative is known as Ui, but this is renamed in Pali as Maranamata. In my recent work digitizing and cataloging Cambodian manuscripts, I've been able to show that many Khmer Buddhist works were translated from Siamese originals particularly during this period, the 17th to the mid-19th century. And the Pali Khmer version of the Jetanabheda conforms to this pattern. And I would suggest that it was translated from a Pali Siamese exemplar probably sometime in the late 18th or early 19th century. And this translation includes this Central Thai edition, namely the Bla Butong or Maranamata tale, and thus the Asian Cinderella narrative finally reaches Khmer speakers. The Pali Khmer Jetanabheda is just the beginning of the Maranamata or Cinderella narrative in Cambodia. In 1877, the frame narrative and the Bla Butong or Maranamata portion of the Jetanabheda are refashioned into a long verse novel in Khmer. And in Khmer, it's known as Moranat Mbiada by a well-known poet named Uk. Uk's version of the story, typically with the outer frame of Anuruddha and the Buddha removed to make it a more accessible story, is extremely popular in Cambodia, as well as in Khmer-speaking communities in southern Vietnam and the Mekong Delta region, and serves as the basis for several complete performances of the tale, both on stage and on film. And like many other Pali Khmer sermons in manuscript form, the Jetanabheda itself has largely been forgotten in Cambodia. Only 4 complete manuscripts survive, plus a handful of other fragments. But the narrative within it, the Jetanabheda's specific version of the Cinderella narrative, is certainly alive and well in contemporary Cambodia. The story of Maranamata or Moranat Mbiada continues to circulate on YouTube through karaoke videos and small budget films, including a queer reimagining of the story by the Bite Bite Lee ensemble, which is replete with K-pop dance covers, and this version has garnered over 1 million views on the social video site. So here we've come a long ways, in a sense, from the questions I was exploring in Act 1 of singular and multiple minds, Act 2 on the generic structures of bitext, and even the beginning of Act 3 on the story of Saupati Kumara and Princess Thaviraga. Such, I would argue, the journeys taken by the Jetanabheda and its many afterlives. Innovations in doctrine, literary structure, and narrative sources are some of the multiple ways we can view Southeast Asian Buddhism from the vantage point of the Jetanabheda. My core assertion here is that Pali vernacular bitexts provide a set of tools that make these kinds of innovations and circulations possible. The flexibility of the bitextual sermon allows the Jetanabheda to attempt a bridge between local ideas and imported Buddhist texts.
At the same time, the bilingual sermon commands enough authority in the ears of its audience to adapt and reframe narratives from outside the Buddhist sphere, in this case, including a Zhuang version of the Cinderella narrative. In Act 1, I placed the Cetanabheda as a node at the intersection of Buddhist and Southeast Asian models of the mind. The 32 soul conception of the Southeast Asian Quan, or Prlung, was ingeniously mapped onto the Buddhist model of what happens at death, generating a plural conception of rebirth. The Cetanabheda uses this multiple rebirth scenario to provide an alternative, quasi-genetic, recombinatory answer to an old Buddhist question on why people are born unequal. In Act 2, I centered the Cetanabheda as an invented polyvernacular sermon composed in 2 languages at once. What began as an exegetical tool for reading classical texts in Sanskrit and Pali developed into a literary style. The incorporation of folk narratives drawn from the oral tradition is a key element in the construction of homiletic texts such as the Cetanabheda. In Act 3, I traced the circulation of this bilingual sermon, both in terms of its multiple recensions on palm leaf and bark paper manuscripts, and in terms of how its Cambodian instantiation led to the spread and popularity of the Cinderella tale there. The Cetanabheda is thus a crucial node through which a regional narrative came to be adopted in music, film, and new media in Cambodia. By way of conclusion here, I'd like to reflect the content of my talk back on my broader research agenda. So first, the Cetanabheda's innovation in terms of doctrine, particularly the doctrine of rebirth, ought to put to rest the notion that Southeast Asia was merely a passive recipient of foreign religious ideas. There are many other manuscript texts from Southeast Asia's monasteries that could reveal similar moments of doctrinal innovation. Second, BITEX are not the product of an inferior understanding of Pali and Sanskrit on the part of Southeast Asian Buddhists. Quite the contrary, they're instead the fruits of a shared set of technical norms that allowed for both traditional scholastic exegesis and, as we see here, new forms of literary expression. In my broader work, I aim to connect the Southeast Asian BITEX and the ways they work with their parallels elsewhere in the world. For religious reading is rarely monolingual. It's very often a bilingual exercise. Third, the manuscripts and inscriptions that form are really only substantial textual record of pre-colonial Southeast Asia are not only relevant for the study of religious past, but also for the narratives and the discourses that they continue to transmit up to the present and the way those narratives live on, are cherished, and are recreated by communities today. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm really looking forward to a chance to discuss with all of you.